nutshell off of your ear. You're not even paying any attention, and the Earthlings are here. Why do I always have to be the practical one? Kate, wake up!
Oh, now you've done it. I was listening to Muha's oration to his troops. I was just getting to the part where he speaks in precision rhyming. What is so very important, Ela?
I said, dear, that the Earthlings are here, my darling, if you would just turn around and see.
Oh, yes, honorable Earthlings. Welcome to our event in honor of Ray Bradbury and a new book edited by Gloria Macmillan, Orbiting Ray Bradbury's Mars. In particular, we would like to thank the Lunar Lab and Festival of Books for sponsoring our trip from Mars to be here as your Martian representatives. And our town council also sends a friendly howdy. Did I get the expression right?
Kay wants to say how much we appreciate Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles for teaching us that we should all respect.
Yes, respect. We Martians have rights, you know. Ray Bradbury says plenty about the abuses of our kind in his book, The Martian.
Our dear audience knows all of this, Kay. Now, let's start with the introductions.
Oh. Oh, Eva, I just had the funniest stuff. Well, should we start talking like the Earthlings have us do in their Hollywood Martian movies? I mean, as if we were robots. I come in peace. Take me to your leadership. Oh, we find this so amusing on Mars because, as we all know, Martians are telepaths and can use many different voices and languages.
No, I think this would be better for our annual Canal Festival next fall when we all share our talents in a show. How about the introductions?
Oh, all right. We are very pleased that so many people have come out to honor our friend Ray Bradbury. He went to school right here on Earth, you know. Amazing. Let's see. Oh, I see he went to a school here in your town of Tucson called Amphi Middle School. Is the physics teacher, Mr. Scott Weiler, here? It has been a while since I was in middle school. Oh, say about 130 of your Earth years. Your students are very talented for one so young, I hear.
Please
this
come
way,
here. Right this way. Thank you.
Who are you? I mean, who were you as a child? Who were you as a teen? That awkward, self-conscious, totally lacking in any coordination, whatever, teen years that you might have had. Could you imagine Ray Bradbury as a teenager? And he wasn't just a teenager back then. He was a nerd. The nerd. Before, if we recall, nerds were cool. We have a lot to thank Ray for that little transition. But Ray was just a boy. For a short time, he lived here in Tucson from age 6 and age 12. And he would get up in the morning to the desert. He would play, he would explore, and he went to school. He went to my school. What was then Amphi Junior High School is now Amphi Middle School, same campus. And on that campus, we have a whole new generation of students. He could have been any child. We teachers see hundreds, thousands of students over a career. In middle school, he could have been studying, would have been studying math, science, reading, and writing. We as teachers, like me, are building a foundation that we take the world, past and future, and lay it on an altar with no expectations. We don't know what students will take from that. He could have been any child. We teachers we see those, so many children over our career, but not every child takes the offering. We teachers don't know, couldn't know what he would take from us. He might have, could have taken anything. He might have, could have taken nothing away from it. We didn't know. We can't know. But I am an engineering and robotics teacher for middle school students here in Tucson. And I lay down everything I can to show students what the possibilities and their futures can hold for them. While here in Tucson, Ray started to write. It was while he was a mere 12 years old, bought a nice little typewriter. He started with horror, like Edgar Allan Poe, because believe me, as a middle school teacher, I see that a lot of students have that emo phase right there at the 12-year-old age. And then he mimicked Edward Rice Burroughs. Our desert lends itself to the stark imagery that Mars could have been. And I wonder what thoughts went through his mind when he spent his time here in Tucson. Ray spoke fondly of his time here. And I got a quote here from the Tucson, interview he did with Tucson Weekly. Ray Bradbury began his long career as a master of imaginative fiction as a 12-year-old boy right here in Tucson. He said, "My parents gave me a primitive $6 typewriter for Christmas in 1932. You got to imagine, $6 from a family of modest means had to be a small fortune. And I began to write short stories about landing on the moon and going off to Mars," Ray Bradbury recalls. "I worked alone and believed in what I did and didn't listen to anyone who doubted me. I loved radio and went and hung around the local station there in Tucson and told my friends I was getting a job as a radio announcer," he says, recalling how he'd get out of class at Amfi Junior High and race over to the station, getting underfoot until he landed again on the air reading comic strips to kids on Saturday night. He wanted it, he found a way to be there, and he took it. It was a perfect occupation for someone like myself. I've been collecting them since I was 9 years old, he says, and my pay was free tickets to see King Kong, Murders in the Wax Museum, and The Mummy. I like the paycheck, but those are some nice perks there. You can't do any better than that, and I've never had a better income in my life since. Are the Ray Bradburys of the world gone? Does Tucson have nothing more to offer in this world? Is this the place that dreams do come to die? Kadeem Carey, who you will definitely hear more about in the future, and Savannah Guthrie of the Today Show would beg to differ. They are both Amphi alumni. Kadeem Carey went to our school. I have several of his family members still in my school. But do we have the next generation of greats in our midst? I had the pleasure to be a teacher to some amazing students. Not only am I privileged to teach engineering and robotics, I coach 2 teams of students in MESA, Math, Engineering, Science Achievement, and VEX Robotics. This allows me to see the true wonder of student potential, and I don't just see great analytical and creative minds, but I see imagination, a wonder amongst them. I see artists in their own right. Kapua is, I've had her for several years now. She keeps coming back to my class. She's a glutton for punishment. But she hasn't conquered the world yet because she's too busy living and exploring life as it is. She has aspirations to be a film director, but we have not ruled out aerospace engineering as a nice backup. You know, a safety program. Michelle, anybody who, she has a very quiet personality, but underneath stirs a very creative and ambitious young girl. Anybody would be foolish to underestimate the awesomeness this young lady is going to present in the future. She has a fascination with robotics. One of my really truly bright students. But instead of going for robotics club, she decided to join engineering to take on a very creative and difficult MESA project, an engineering project. And she just saw it and took charge of that particular project. Isaac, he's a very cool cat. But once you get below that cool, you can see that he has a heart and the soul of not only just an engineer, but also a poet. That he has aspirations to be an engineer and astronaut. I have no doubt that he could actually do these things and be so much more. We have, as a world, and these are my other students who have great aspirations. And these aren't the only ones that I have. These are just the ones who, when I talk about Mars, see themselves being there. I've had a very blessed opportunity during my summers to be working with Paragon Space Development Corporation here in Tucson, where I worked on the Inspiration Mars and Mars One projects. So I've gotten to see what is coming down the line for our future in Mars. I share this with my students, and they see their future in Mars. As we know, we have a task at hand. We know we have problems here. And we know there's no simple solutions. And we know we can't fix them all ourselves. Our children, my children, two little guys, my daughter and my son there in the back, have to face this burden. Sorry, Sam. This doesn't mean we just look for the technical solutions. Because what is our civilization if we don't have our soul? This means that we have to, besides STEM, which anybody who's ever turned on the evening news knows a big push that we have to have. But I encourage that there is a moniker of the arts in there. Mixing science, technology, engineering, arts, math, to not only allow students to think scientifically with problem solving, but to think creatively, to solve solutions outside the box, outside the scope of what they had. Because if it wasn't for the Ray Bradburys or the Gene Roddenberrys of the world, we wouldn't be looking at what we could solve. They inspired us to push ourselves forward. One story from Ray's life that wowed me is one where he was inspired by Mr. Electrico, a carnival sideshow performer in Waukegan, Illinois. With an electrified sword, he told Ray to live forever. And though, unfortunately, Ray has passed from us too soon and fairly recently, I dare say that he does live forever. There was somebody that touched his life and made him great. Do we not all have that capability? Yes, I am a teacher. I have the ability to make connections, but we all have the ability to make connections. To 1,000, to 1,000,000 people. Not all of them will take, but some of them will. And so what I'm asking is, are we out here ready to inspire? Because everybody starts somewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. I'm sure that the youth of Earth are lucky to have such wise teachers. We hope that some of your students have made it here today. Are any of you here? Any of the students? Oh, woo, look at that. Good. Good for you. Welcome. All right. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Peter Smith. We hear on Mars that the device that landed in my neighbor's ranch land came from right here in this town, Tucson. Is that true?
That's right.
Well, I see
Very
that
proud of it, too.
I see that the lander was controlled from right here in Tucson.
Professor Smith, just as a point of information, did you get a Martian landing permit before you set down on our American grown-ups land?
What's your immigration status, man?
Too
playing hide and seek with me for years. Do you know how many missions we've made to Mars looking for just you two?
You're looking the wrong way, sir. I'm sorry.
We looked under rocks where you might live. Where else?
Around rocks.
Here you turn up in Tucson.
Well, we're going to have to deal with your parking ticket later. But for now, we're going to hear what you have to say about Mr. Bradbury. Did I hear that he inspired you of some sort? I was inspired by New Car when I was a young sprout. And I...
Okay, let's hear for our esteemed friend, Peter Smith. Come on.
Well, that's true. Ray Bradbury did inspire me. As I was a student at Mansfield Junior High, not Amphi, but Mansfield, and I went to Tucson High here in Tucson. And every week on Sunday, my father would take my brother and I to the Tucson Library, which is now the Children's Museum, but was a library when I was young. And I would return with the legally stack of books. You could only take out so many books before they wouldn't let you take out anymore. And they were all science fiction. And I sat in the easy chair, read those books, and traveled around the world, and just loved it. And one of my favorite books was The Illustrated Man. And in thinking about Ray Bradbury, I wrote the foreword to the book. The book, for those of you who haven't read it, let me tell you, it's not just about tattooed men. It's about a man whose tattoos are magical. And if you look at them long enough, they start to move, and they start to tell stories. And out of those stories, if you get caught into them, you find that your future is being predicted for you in a very kind of nasty way, and you wish you'd never looked, but there you have, and now your future is cemented for you by the Illustrated Man. And I thought, well, doesn't that describe Ray Bradbury, who looks into the future and tells us what might be happening in our future, and we better pay attention. Next slide. And so when I wrote the foreword, I talked about not only Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, but the journeys that he took me on became an obsession and allowed me to explore unknowable worlds from my armchair. The greatest adventures were those where the trail of fantasy crossed the highway of reality. I have lived my life on this crossroads, and that is true. There's the daily life, which has been in this building of all places. I've been here over 30 years. And there's the reality of dealing with science projects. And then there's the other part of the day when you're not here and when you're looking out at the sunset and you start to dream, or you're looking at the night sky and you look at the star patterns and you start to dream of other realities that could well be. And so for my life, it's been a bit of a downward hill. When I was young, I knew more about Mars from reading Ray Bradbury and other authors than I do today after many missions to Mars. Next slide. For instance, I knew that on Mars there were six-legged apes. This is not a Ray Bradbury story, but a Burroughs story, which I think was very influential for Bradbury. And there's a young Peter Smith with his sword rescuing his girlfriend. And this was such a thrill to me that I imagined actually going to Mars one day. Well, I never was able to go to Mars next. But I was able to send a spacecraft to Mars, which landed, gosh, it's almost 6 years ago now. In May, it'll be 6 years ago. And we explored the polar region of Mars, finding ice and looking for potential for life. But now our expectations are somewhat lower. We're not looking for six-legged apes anymore. We have changed the scale. We are looking for smaller and smaller apes, down to the point where you need a microscope to see them. And so our expectations for apes on Mars are now something you might see under an electron microscope. But we didn't have an electron microscope, so we didn't have much chance of seeing those microbes. The next slide. And this is our team. We ran this mission from Tucson. When we wrote the proposal, we insisted that we operate the mission from Tucson, and that be the center of the Earth's effort to explore the polar regions of Mars, because Tucson is where it happens. This is where the great book festivals are. This is where the gem and mineral shows are. This is the place, and it should be Space Valley, in my opinion, you know. It's already got the label Optics Valley, but, you know, I mean, that's just a pair of glasses. We got to get it out in space. Well, you got it. So there's our team. There's probably 35 or 40 students in this picture. We really wanted students to be involved, and in fact, many of these students have gone on to very valuable careers in aerospace and technological endeavors. Although there was one student, when we had the Regents visit, they asked him what his major was. He says, well, since starting to work for the Phoenix mission, I have changed my major, he says. I am now in criminal justice. Excellent. And so, yes, Martian Chronicles inspired dreams. Some of them not so pretty, nightmares perhaps. And so here's an illustration from the Martian Chronicles. And we dream about Mars. And I think Ray Bradbury would be very happy to see that not only do we dream about Mars, but next, our dreams can become reality. And here's the Phoenix mission with a scoop of Martian soil ready to analyze it on board. We don't bring it back to Earth because we don't have that capability yet, but we analyze it there and send the data back by radio waves. But I think Ray has gone well beyond analyzing soil for slight hints of organic material or, you know, some sort of mineral that we don't expect. I think the next slide. I think he's waiting for our future, which has yet to come. And I want to point out, well, for one thing, is this going to be an American flag on this astronaut's arm? Yeah. When this happens, I mean, who knows? We like to think that it's the Americans who are going to get to Mars first, but it could be Chinese or Russian or Indian or Brazilian. All spacefaring, or I'm sorry, European. But our future is tremendously exciting. I have joined a group called Mars One, and the idea is to start a Mars colony and to send people to Mars, but without all the complexity of bringing them back home. Hey, now wait a minute. When the Mormons settled Utah, did they go back and visit their folks every weekend? It was a one-way trip. And so a one-way trip makes some sense. And every 2 years, when Mars lines up with the Earth and you can send a mission, you add more people to this colony. And you just keep adding to it, and adding to it, and adding to it. And they make greenhouses, and they drill wells down to pump water out of the ground. And that's how it starts. And then pretty soon they're having babies. And who knows how 1/3 gravity would evolve in children. Well, actually, we do know. It would turn green. Thank you very much.
Now, that's our mayor. Did want me to ask you about your thing, the Phoenix Marslander. He wanted to know if he could change it into a type of yard sculpture.
Well, there's a price required there.
Well, his wife wanted to make it into a type of sundial. Well, I'm sure we can work something out. Thank you so much.
Come to this.
Now, let's see. We have another illustrious Earthman, Professor Bill Hartman. I don't know why Earthlings write so small. It says that Bill has painted our beautiful planet Mars, which we call Terror, by the way, many times. Would you like to come up and share some of that with us? I was just informed that he actually knew Ray Bradbury, so this is a great honor. Please, come up and tell us something about Ray Bradbury. Professor Hartman could not be here today in person, so he's going to speak to us by video. Ela, isn't that cute? They have video here too.
Hi everybody, welcome to Mars Madness and the launch of Gloria's wonderful book. I wanted to start right up front with the book because on the front, Gloria asked if she could use one of my paintings, and so this disc of Mars is a painting of mine that I want to tell you about. What I did there was try to show not really the Mars that we scientifically know today, but the basic markings on Mars, but with the features that people thought existed on Mars back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and then when Ray was growing up. And what I'm talking about is that, Percival Lowell, an astronomer, came to Flagstaff, made an observatory up there on Mars Hill in Flagstaff, and believed that he was seeing straight line features, which many other astronomers had reported also. But Lowell thought these were precisely straight lines and called them canals. And he concluded that the civilization on Mars that had built these big canals. So I wanted to imagine, suppose the first spacecraft to get to Mars, which were Mariner 4 in the mid-1960s, Mariner 67, and Mariner 9 in the early 70s. Imagine if one of those spacecraft was approaching Mars and turned on the cameras and actually saw the Mars that Ray Bradbury grew up with, which was this Mars with canals and a possible civilization. Now, I was really interested in why the astronomers in Africa had seen canals. So in a book I did, Traveler's Guide to Mars, I arranged some pictures with a map from the 1800s, a map that's a modern map that was made in Flagstaff in, say, the 1960s, and then the actual photographs from Mars. So what you discover is that in the places where people saw the most prominent canals, there actually were streaks on Mars, which was wind-blown dust blown out of craters, for instance. If you had dark dust on the floor of the crater and the windstorm comes through, and it leaves this big tail of dust on the surface, which then looks like a straight line if you're just barely glimpsing it in the telescope. So there was something actually there, and it's interesting to imagine Ray growing up with this idea of civilization on Mars. For our book, we did a little painting of what Mars might have looked like if there were the Mars civilization. And my friend Ron Miller did this digital artwork, and it's kind of fun because we put some Martians on a balcony, and that little piece of the picture is actually based directly on an illustration from a magazine in 1910 showing what Lowell thought was there. And the magazine, of all things, was Cosmopolitan, when it was actually running articles about Mars. So there's the canals and so forth. I actually met Ray later on. I was on the Mariner 9 mission. That was really exciting because we discovered the big volcanoes and the dry riverbeds that look like the Santa Cruz and dunes and all these other features. That was the first mission to map Mars from orbit. And at the end of the mission, so we're talking around 1973, 74, I had the idea, well, we were invited to produce a book in a NASA series about the mission itself. There was a series of these books, one after each mission. So I had volunteered to get into that. And I had this idea that Jet Propulsion Lab people were in contact with Bradbury, and I got his phone number, and I had this idea we could get Ray Bradbury to write the preface for our little book. And I called him up, and he did write it. So we have this beautiful one-page preface from Ray. And it's all about the fantastic idea of landing on Mars, and if there's even one paramecium. We have to treasure that and preserve the environment on Mars where these organisms might have grown and so forth. Put that in the book. The last minute, one of the NASA officials decided to cut Bradbury's preface out of the book. And the reason was that NASA couldn't go on record, supposedly, with the idea that there might be a paramecium on Mars, and that was just too far out. And so my wonderful Ray Bradbury preface went down the tubes. But I did have chances to interact with Bradbury. You know, he came here, I think you'll hear more in the discussions today about the time he spent in Tucson. And he had a boyhood friend here. And so he came to Tucson a couple of times and gave talks. And after one of those, they were looking for a place to take Ray after the talk, and our house is just a few blocks from campus. So he actually came over and sat in our living room. That was really cool. And I had a chance to get some of my Bradbury books autographed and so forth. So it was really fun just sitting around and talking with him. But what I remember from his talks were how ebullient and enthusiastic he was. And he said, my favorite quote was that I can't understand these writers that have writer's block, and I can't think of anything right. He says, when I wake up in the morning, I have all these ideas in my head, and they all say, write me, and I have to decide which one I'm going to write that day. So he was full of ideas. I just wanted to thank Gloria for the wonderful book, but also thank all the scientists and artists and writers and engineers who lived in Tucson and helped make such a creative community that we have here.
We wish to thank Professor Hartman for sharing his art and memories. Now we have Mr. David Ackland, a real Earth aerospace engineer.
Mr. Ackland, have you ever ridden in a Martian sand ship?
Oh, no, but I bet that would be exciting.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Well, you have missed one of the solar system's marvels in engineering. They run on green power, you know, like... Oh, I will have to take you for a short ride. Next time you visit her.
Yes, you know, it sounds like the noise that riding in the gunner's seat of a Cobra helicopter. Right on the nap of the earth.
I'll have to check on
yours sounds more interesting.
Well, we look forward to your talk, sir.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for coming in and joining us in this great event here. Gloria and I are connected through community outreach in the, we like to say, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. It's a right brain, left brain thing. And one of the things that she suggested when we learned of Ray's passing, she had this idea of writing this, pulling this book together. And she said, would you be interested in contributing a chapter to this book? And I'm going, why not? I'm retired. I could all the time in the world. I don't know what I'm going to write. So I scribbled some stuff together and gathered my thoughts and went, Ray Bradbury, well, you know, he was kind of in and out of my life. But then I got to remembering, you know, back in my high school days, back in the 60s, we didn't have internet and all this technology that the kids have today, but, you know, you had to write these book reports. And you just didn't seem to have enough time. So one trick is that you'd get a book that kind of looked interesting. You read the couple chapters in the front, a couple chapters in the end, and you guess what's in the middle, and you write something, and hopefully you got a C in passed. Well, unfortunately, the Martian Chronicles turned out to be one of those books that I did that, and I was so confused. I don't know if I got a C on it. I think the teacher knew that he didn't read this thing. But, you know, I saw Mars, Martian. I said, oh, I was always fascinated by space and Mars. In my little chapter that I contribute there, I talk a little bit about my growing up as a baby boomer in the 50s and big brother and young uncle and that, getting me excited about the various things of going to space. Ray Bradbury, of course, his Martian Chronicles were put together in the 40s, before I was born, and they ran as a series of articles in the local newspaper, inserts on that. So Martian Chronicles kind of, well, I don't know where it fits. Well, in the early 70s, I was attending college up at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and I was taking a philosophy course. And our professor and her husband, both fairly serious philosophers, and forgive me, I could not find their names when I was trying to give them credit to the book. It's just been too many years, too many senior moments. But she brought up the point that they were tasked, along with several other philosophers, by NASA to think outside of the box. We're going to put the Viking landers on Mars, so we're going to put a spacecraft on Mars. And NASA actually asked them, what have we not thought about? And so she shared that with us, and she said, now, what I want you to do to prepare for some lengthy philosophical discussions on this, read the Martian Chronicles. Oh my gosh, I get a chance to reread this book. Well, at that time I was married, had a family, and was in the Air Force, and just, busier and all get out, and I was taking this class after work. I'm going, oh boy, I can't do the thing I did in high school, read the first chapters and the last one. I've got to read this thing. So I struggled my way through it, and then I realized, boy, this is really a complex book. But the interesting thing about it is it really did stimulate some great discussions about thinking outside of the box. My God, if this Viking lander came down and one of its pads happened to crush an entire civilization just because we didn't think they looked like that, I give NASA credit for at least spending our tax dollars to hire these people to go think about that. Well, that behind me, I have to admit, I've reread the Martian Chronicles several times since then, including when Gloria asked me to go do this. I said, I better go dig this thing out if I'm going to talk about it. But I had the fortunate experience. I spent a career in the Air Force, worked primarily out here in the Southwest, spent a good number of years developing this thing we call GPS out in the deserts north of Yuma, and having an opportunity to really, where the rubber meets the road type of thing, kick the stones and see some of the ancient stuff that is left by previous civilizations here in Arizona, southern Arizona. And then reading back into the book, you start to piece together, you go, there is a connection between what Bradbury is writing about and our southwestern deserts. In my travels with the Air Force, and we did travel back and forth across the country because we grew up in the Midwest there, and we'd trek across in our poor little Volkswagen and hope we'd make it successfully. But you'd look at, and at that time, the interstates were still being built. And little by little on each trip, you would see that, gee, this interstate all of a sudden just cut out these very interesting communities that we used to stop and get a great ham and eggs breakfast or something. You start putting those pieces together, and I go, oh my gosh, this is a lot like the stuff that Bradbury is expounding in the Martian Chronicles. Then you see the destructive thing, and I'll let you do the reading yourself. I hope you buy our book and get into it. But we have petroglyphs in southern Arizona here. Now, in my experience, I used to fly around in helicopters a lot in the development of the GPS days. And the pilots knew of these petroglyphs that you really couldn't see from the ground. They were very obvious, you knew where to fly and go look at these things. And I thought, this is really interesting. And the sad part about it is that during this period of time, I think the off-roaders were really starting. And it was sad to see the off-road tracks that went right across the thing. Obviously, they're skimming across the desert in these four-wheelers and not paying attention. They just went perturbed. A very, very ancient piece of artwork in the Southwest desert. And again, Bradbury, I think, captures that nicely in his Martian Chronicles about the destructiveness. I do talk also about, and the chapter that I wrote is called The Unintentional Invasion of Mars. And it really gets down to the level that Dr. Smith here expounded upon, is that we're looking down at the microbial level on this. But the question that came up, when I think it was Surveyor 4 or 5 that Alan Bean brought the camera back to from the moon. And in further examinations, been up there on the moon for a couple of years, I guess. But there was some common virus, and it's got a nice long biological term to it. But essentially somebody maybe sneezed in the camera works when they were building it, the virus was not dead after living on the moon in this camera for a couple of years. And so that inspired, I think, a lot of the safety precautions that NASA does. I know, Peter, with your Phoenix Mars lander, you had a bio bag and shield over the arm and that. But you look at it, and of course, our latest rover up there on the Martian surface, Curiosity, we had a little bit of the pressure to get things done. I guess the drills weren't completely run through all the steps on it, so there was some concern. I guess they're going to be exposed to the Martian atmosphere long enough that it probably is not going to be, and I don't think they used any initial drill samples. But it's those little things on that again you tie back into Bradbury's Martian Chronicles of how we as human beings, we mean our best, but sometimes in our pure ignorance or rushing through something because we have a very tight schedule to meet in space missions. I know Peter would really vouch for it. You miss it and you're done for a couple of years to Mars almost, and all that stuff costs that mighty money, whatever it is in Martian terms. So that's my little bit about Ray Bradbury. Of course, I didn't know him personally. I did share a conversation with Bill Hartman. I'm so glad that he gave us his video clip because he shared a few of his anecdotes with actually meeting the fellow. Hope you enjoy our book. And one other thing, before I close, to say, it is a collection. We look at 5 lenses, I believe, of looking at this person, Ray Bradbury, and his works. I can't say how humble I am to share with such wonderful writers. I really feel like that high school kid that didn't read the full book in writing it, but it was a privilege, Gloria, to write a chapter in your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Emblem.
You're welcome.
I see that we have another esteemed speaker, Mr. Wolf Forrest. Oh. You know, we have no forests on Mars. But, well, welcome right up here. Throughout his life, Mr. Forrest has always taken the road less traveled. Some say it's because he's independent, creative, and adventurous. His friends say it's because he never asks for directions. We look forward to hearing his unique perspective on Ray Bradbury and his works.
Thank you, Mr. K. and Beulah. And if you plan to abduct me later, please, no vivisection, no probing. And you can see the title of this brief presentation is I Led 3 Lives, Bradbury's Martian ability to appear simultaneously as a weird writer, a genre writer, and a regional writer. The title of my essay in the collection orbiting Ray Bradbury's Mars is The Sorcerer's Apprentices, how the lives of 3 regional weird fiction writers became creatively entangled, but for the purposes of this brief presentation, you'll be convinced. This essay's title was a reference to one of Robert Bloch's teleplays for the TV show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. When Bradbury was born in Waukegan, Illinois in 1920, 3-year-old Bloch was living 40 miles away in Chicago, and 150 miles to the northwest in Sauk City, Wisconsin, 11-year-old August Derleth was exploring the wilderness with the zeal of a naturalist, and as adults their careers would intertwine conspicuously. One day Derleth, seen here, would publish both Bloch and Bradbury's first hardbound collection of short stories. Bradbury had written to Derleth in 1939 praising the publication of The Outsider and Others, an anthology of H.P. Lovecraft's short fiction under the imprimatur Arkham House. Whoa. Both Derleth and his business partner, Donald Wandre, had wanted for years to rescue the stories of Lovecraft from pulp obscurity, and in doing so, change publishing history. And here are the covers for Bradbury and Bloch's first books. Robert Bloch, of course, seen here, is the man most famous as having written the novel Psycho. He kind of looks like a Tim Burton character. I mean, he looks like a horror writer. Later, the book was turned into a movie by Alfred Hitchcock. Norman Bates was modeled after notorious Wisconsin serial killer Ed Gein, seen here. Consider Gein's bucolic appearance, which masked a tortured personality, curiously mimicked by Johnny Carson's skit character Floyd Turtle. The title of this presentation, I Led 3 Lives, is a reference to a 1950s television show about FBI informant Herbert Philbrick, and Bradbury hit his stride in that decade and never looked back. With the publication of the Martian Chronicles, the Illustrated Man, Fahrenheit 451, and the Golden Apples of the Sun, all using recycled stories woven into a tapestry of myth, he campaigned successfully to have the label science fiction removed from his hardbound books. EC Comics invested in the tradition of weird tales in other magazines and consequently borrowed liberally from Bradbury's pulp stories. So much so that he had to dispatch carefully worded letters that called attention to their oversight and not paying him for secondary publishing rights. In any event, a relationship was hatched, and many of his best stories found their way into this new market until censorship, backlash against violence and gore in juvenile media, and the threat of bankruptcy changed the culture of fantastic publishing again. Magic and illusion were driving forces in Bradbury's life. When he was 7, he saw a poster of Blackstone the Magician performing at the Genesee Theater in Waukegan. And when he was 12, a sideshow act named Mr. Electrico exhorted him to, quote, live forever. And as a writer of some considerable success, has probably now accomplished just that. Bradbury and Durrell were particularly a product of the public library system and were thusly exposed to all types of books. Durrell wrote Sac Prairie novels and detective fiction, as well as horror and children's literature. He was the most regional of the three. His first Sac Prairie novel, Place of Hawks, was admired by such writers as Sinclair Lewis and filled a void in the historical fiction of Wisconsin. His detective, Solar Ponds, appeared in some 70 stories and is patterned largely after Sherlock Holmes. Well, was Jules Verne a regional writer? Bradbury certainly fell under his spell. Except for the boats that sailed up the Loire River, which may have fueled his imagination about forms of travel, particularly hot air balloons and submarines, Verne had no love for his country, but his ability to extrapolate from the social and technical issues of the day found a sympathetic soul in Bradbury. Bradbury had a particular affinity for Charles Dickens, who often used grim situations in fantasy to comment on social justice. If you don't think of Dickens as a horror writer, then read his account of spontaneous human combustion in Bleak House. Herman Melville was both a genre and a regional writer, having lifted the trade of going to sea to an art form in books like Moby Dick, the unfinished Billy Budd the Sailor, Type P, and Oh Moo. When John Huston saw the film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, based on Bradbury's story The Foghorn, which had appeared under its new title in the Saturday Evening Post, he saw pathos in the lonely sea monster who destroyed a lighthouse, and allowed Bradbury to turn Melville's lengthy discourse on cetacean philosophy into a battle of wits between Ahab and the white whale. Although his relationship with Huston was rocky and extracted more than a pound of flesh from the young writer, Bradbury's ability to write for the screen was vindicated. He had already produced a treatment for It Came from Outer Space, so complete that screenwriter Harry Essex merely had to plug the words into an industry template. Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, Carson McCullers, Manly Wade Williams, and William Faulkner invested heavily in their own regionality. In their writings, an odd character or two would surface with regularity, and in their struggles, quality of character emerged. In A Worn Path, Welty's tale of an elderly black woman making a journey to get medicine for her grandson reminds us of the narrator in The Illustrated Man. Another odd coincidence is that Welty published a collection of stories called The Golden Apples in 1949, while Bradbury published The Golden Apples of the Sun in 1953, both probably inspired by the Yeats poem The Song of Wandering Angus. Both writers make heavy use of mythological references in their works, specifically the choice between golden apples and silver apples, as it applies to the Yeats poem, is about choices the characters make in redirecting their lives. Bradbury's fictional and recurring Greentown lies in a realm similar to Faulkner's Yakapanawa County, H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham, Massachusetts, and Washington Irving's Catskills and Hudson River Valley. Bradbury's writing has always had a visual component to it. Though he's been illustrated by some of the best who ever worked in the venue of pulp magazines and comic art, including Hans Bach, Lee Brown Coit, and Lawrence Stevens, it was Joe Bugnani who dominated the last half of Bradbury's literary career, starting with the cover for Fahrenheit 451. His Hawthorne-esque solitary gabled house for the October country has a disquietude, much like the Andrew Wyeth painting Christina's World, which depicts a crippled young woman struggling to reach a distant farmhouse. There is a horror of openness, like the horror of whiteness Ishmael described in Moby Dick, a singularity which compels the viewer or reader to imagine the worst. When the Viking lander touched down on Mars in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial, the first pictures back were compared to the Arizona desert. It must have been a feeling of coming full circle for Bradbury, who wrote a poem to celebrate the event. as he played in the dry washes of Tucson during the Great Depression, perhaps after having read one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars stories, or having just written one on the toy typewriter given to him the Christmas before. Perhaps he thought of Percival Lowell or Schiaparelli and the canals of Mars that captured his imagination. His time in the old Pueblo was a fairly smooth transition. Bradbury's last house in Tucson, with its gables and picket fence, was more like the Midwest homes he was used to in Illinois. The short walk to downtown may have led him to explore El Teradito, the wishing shrine. Its tale of revenge and murder embedded in the history of Mexico would figure significantly in his writing. Certainly the movies had a profound effect on the boy. He saw The Phantom of the Opera at 3, a movie Robert Bloch also saw during its initial run, and credits partly for him having become a horror writer. Bradbury also cites King Kong as a major influence, and it's almost certain that he saw the film at the Fox Theater in Tucson during its initial release in the spring of 1933. Bradbury's ability to morph into a regional writer came from his experiences as a boy and his experiences in Mexico. He has eschewed the label of science fiction writer, saying in many interviews that Fahrenheit 451 is his only science fiction novel. Based on his predictions of wall-sized TV screens, earbuds, and the ongoing threat of censorship in that particular book, it would be hard to argue his point. The Martian Chronicles, published initially as The Silver Locust in England, a nod to one of the book's chapter titles and descriptive of the predatory nature of the new Martians, is more of a fractured ring of mythologies than is science fiction, a point that Bradbury has made on several occasions. This is not to say that Bradbury didn't make extensive use of the trappings of science fiction, like rockets and time travel. These devices were used to make a point, as all good fiction ultimately involves the growth of character or the resolution of conflict to show both the weaknesses and strengths of human beings. Look at the Oscar-winning movie Gravity, and then reread Bradbury's short story Kaleidoscope, and you will see how hard it is to keep a good story down, whether or not the filmmakers acknowledge the source. Bradbury's time in Tucson prepared him for his first trip to Mexico in 1945. One such publication, The Mummies of Guanajuato, featured photographs of the famous corpses along with Bradbury's story, The Next in Line, about a woman obsessed with death who resists her husband's insistence that they visit the catacombs. Other stories influences Mexico include The Candy Skull, El Dia de la Muerta, and the story The Life Work of Juan Diaz, which became an episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. This experience percolated down into an analysis of how cultures are different and led him to write a nonfiction piece, I See You Never, in 1947 about a Mexican immigrant who was deported for overstaying his visa. Given the current dialogue over border issues, immigration, and right-to-work concerns, it was both prescient and forward-looking. Ultimately, the Martian Chronicles would embrace this conscience, presenting issues of racism and colonialism as well as environmental concerns. Both Bloch and Bradbury wrote teleplays for Alfred Hitchcock. Bradbury wrote 3 scripts for Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone, one of which was produced, I Sing the Body Electric. Bloch wrote for Boris Karloff's Thriller and Star Trek, and adapted Durla's story Lagoda's Heads for Serling's Night Gallery. Bradbury landed in LA as a consequence of the Great Depression, whereas Robert Bloch made the move years later as a professional. Durla stayed in Wisconsin to carve out his own niche as a writer and publisher. The readers that remember Bradbury for his nostalgia in books like Dandelion Wine, which carried the thread of his Waukegan boyhood forward, or stories like The Rocket, forget the sinister writer that penned stories like The Jar or Skeleton. His early attempts at derivative science fiction like Pendulum or The Candle were soon replaced by his own voice. The fact that he ultimately was published in Weird Tales along with colleagues like Leigh Brackett, Henry Kuttner, Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, and of course Robert Bloch, gave him an opportunity to measure his progress as a writer. Bradbury's influence is extensive. In 1971, the Apollo 15 astronauts visited Hadley Rill and named the lunar crater Dandelion after Bradbury's novel. I don't know if you can see it. It's in the lower right-hand, there it is. It's hard to read, but it's there nevertheless. After the Curiosity rover landed on Mars on August 6, 2012, an area near the Gale crater was named Bradbury Landing on his 92nd birthday 16 days later as a tribute to the man who had died 2 months earlier. Engineers and men of science recognize their cultural value of Ray Bradbury and were just as influenced by him to pursue their dreams as they were by Copernicus and Sikorsky. Whatever you call him, science fiction writer, master of horror, a nostalgic poet like fellow Midwesterner Carl Sandburg, or just a documenter of human experience, Bradbury is unique. He has the popularity among general readers of Danielle Steele with none of the empty calories. Those who write with a voice that reflect their geographic status or opt for a particular genre to define their portfolio have found a chameleon in their midst who make the value of storytelling shape the other factors that complete the tale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Forrest. I see here we have an illustrious Earth filmmaker next. Our esteemed friend, Howard Allen. Mr. Allen, please, come up here. Tell me, why do you Earth filmmakers always make us Martians talk like this?
I'm an Arizona filmmaker. That's just Hollywood.
Well, let us welcome Mr. Howard Allen, who is also a doctor.
Well, script doctor. Screenplays, plays, and books.
This is a medical specialty we have not heard of on Terra. Well, anyways, we look forward to hearing what you like about Bradbury films.
Thank you. I think that it's somehow appropriate to be talking about Ray Bradbury and talking to Martians from our own community here at the same time. Because he was a man who didn't think outside the box. He didn't think there was a box. And like Mr. Smith, he went to the library and read books voraciously and wrote voraciously and didn't like to think of himself, as Wolf said here, as a particular kind of writer. And so it's of course pretty interesting when Hollywood has to deal with someone who doesn't think of themselves as a particular genre kind of writer. Doesn't make it easy for them, all right? At scriptdoctor.com and at Honeymoon Films, I see a lot of stories about supernatural or science fiction or horror elements, but rarely do they come close to Ray Bradbury. And it's because they don't have his touch, because the imagination is lacking, and more important, the human condition is missing. Every one of those genres, every one of those approaches was an excuse to talk about the human condition. In my chapter in the book, you'll hear Stephen King say it started for him with Ray Bradbury. And it's because he could see the human condition in a horror story. So it was more about telling a story than it was about telling a horror story. And if you've seen The Shawshank Redemption, you know that he was inspired pretty well by Ray Bradbury, who is entirely capable of going into any kind of story, including writing the screenplay for Moby Dick for director Houston, including Fahrenheit 451, which I defy you to tell me what the genre of Fahrenheit 451 is. Okay? As I say in my chapter, he was captured, and we've heard earlier, captured by magic and the magic of new worlds, even as a child. And how did Hollywood deal with the magic of Ray Bradbury? Well, let's watch a clip from early in the movie from 1969 of The Illustrated Man. In the book, Bradbury used the meeting we are about to see between this young man and the Illustrated Man as simply a prologue and epilogue, a framing device in the book of short stories. He had another story called The Illustrated Man. So let's see what Hollywood did. All right? Go ahead.
I'll show you why. Oh my God. Well, go on, take a look.
saw anything like that. Well, that's the most fantastic thing I ever saw. Is that what you meant by skin illustrations? Tattoos?
They're not tattoos, they're skin illustrations. Don't you ever call them tattoos. Let me tell you, don't you look at those illustrations too long, because they'll come alive and they'll tell you stories. You remember that lady that I was talking to you about? Remember her? Well, I'll tell you what she did for me. She created for me my own private hell. You see that blank space on my back there? See it? And now the people look into that, and they see the future. That's all well and good. But if you want to see your future, you may have to pay a price, because you may look in there and see how you're going to die. You may look in there and see what you're going to look like when you're old and rotten and shriveled and mean and through. Well, people don't like to see that, do they? No, they don't. So after a while, they don't like me, and then after a while, they grow to hate me.
Do you have any doubts about getting tattooed all over like that?
I wasn't thinking about getting tattooed. I was thinking about getting laid. And I told you once before, and this is the last time I'm going to tell you. Please, don't ever call them tattoos.
All right. Now, I was 19 years old when I saw this, and I wanted to become a storyteller, not because of what Hollywood did, but because of the way Ray Bradbury thinks. That there can be a space on that man's back that can become something that tells you about you. And it could be anything, and it could take you anywhere, and he does that. He takes you anywhere. If you thought that scene was a little melodramatic, you're right. And if you read my chapter in the book, you're going to find out that Hollywood didn't do a great job with the illustrated man, mostly because they went for the melodrama, and because the witch artist woman, who you're going to see briefly here for a second, played by Claire Bloom, who put the skin illustrations on the man, and the character Carl, played by Rod Steiger, becomes the center of the movie. And it's just the framing device in the book. But fortunately for us, the filmmakers stopped and did 3 short stories of Ray Bradbury inside this cheesy melodrama about Rod Steiger and his wife Claire Bloom, all right? Including The Veldt, which we're going to see now. Yeah.
I don't know, where, I could say where the lions live down in Africa.
Oops, not getting the sound here.
Right there, well, one that said it. There, where the lions live down in Africa. She had lived in the past, she had lived in the future. She put it all on me. The filthy things.
Lions.
No, not the lions, the stinking vultures in the tree.
Did you just see just what I've been seeing every day for weeks?
Well, I've seen it. Come on, let's go.
Well, we're having an audio problem. Let's see here.
Suppose they're feeding on.
I don't know, maybe zebra, giraffe, something like that. Come on, come on.
Carl? You hear a scream?
No.
Didn't hear anything.
I didn't hear anything.
I don't want our children to play here anymore, Carl. Please turn it off.
That was high tech in 1969.
Same African adult for weeks now. I think you and Johnny have been out.
All right. It was your idea to install the playroom in the first place so our children could work off the, what was it you called it, natural hostility.
I'm sorry we ever bought the damn thing.
So am I, but you're the one that sold me on the free involvement theory, an instantaneous atmosphere. If a child wants anything, wishes it hard enough, all he has to do is flip a switch and there you are.
We can stop there. It's enough to see their fear of their child's toy. And it's not an accident if this reminds you of video games, virtual reality, and the newest thing, augmented reality. And we talked about the movie Gravity. We're talking about a kind of approach to storytelling that makes you feel like you live inside of it. And what if you did live inside of it? And what if your children got a little too fascinated with lions in the belt who eat things? And that is the part of the story that for me is the most Ray Bradbury. What happens to this little futuristic family when they're faced with this? And that is what he brought to any kind of story he did. And in fact, we got Roger Ebert in a couple of different times, not only about Fahrenheit 451, but there was a movie called Something Wicked This Way Comes in 1983 that Hollywood had the genius of just letting Ray Bradbury's own screenplay be the only screenplay in the movie. And what happened is, and I will quote my hero Roger Ebert, there's another interesting thing about this movie. It's one of the few literary adaptations I've seen in which the film not only captures the mood and tone of the novel, but also the novel's style. Bradbury's prose is a strange hybrid of craftsmanship and lyricism. He builds his stories and novels in a straightforward way with strong plotting, but his sentences owe more to Thomas Wolfe than to pulp tradition, and his lyricism isn't missing in this movie. And the lyricism, I think, is what inspires people in science, as well as people in the arts, to cross over and see that there's something more going on here. Because he's imagined the world on Mars doesn't take away from who it is that might be up there exploring it. And how much does that person feel like you? And can you identify with them? Okay? And exploring new worlds, even if it's an empty space on a man's back, can take you to wonderful places. And for me, that is Ray Bradbury. Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent presentations, Earth friends. What a joyous day this has been.
All that's missing is a giant goblet of nutberry wine.
We are not done yet, Kay. We have a most important announcement to all of our Earth audience. The University of Arizona Main Library has a new display of science fiction, science, and Ray Bradbury materials from now until August 1st.
Dear Earthlings, gentles all, we are enjoying our trip, eating your strange, delightful foods, and noticing how very wet everything seems to be here.
Enchantingly wet.
Yes, quite so. And now, is there anything any of you want to ask us? Yes.
I just want to point out that you haven't thanked your travel agent who brought you here.
So,
One Gloria McMillan needs to stand up and give
Yes.
a bow here.
Oh, yeah.
thank you for that. Anyone else have anything to say?
Now we invite you to come to the library for some Martian refreshments and some Ray Bradbury treasures never before seen by human eyes. Well, Arizona human eyes. Follow us, Earthlings!